Hi, I'm Maddie, and welcome back to my podcast, Girls Gone Great. This podcast emphasizes and discusses the significant conflicts that occur worldwide, and today I'll be interviewing 4 educated guests. I will also include my own perspective at the end. The 5 of us will be discussing Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, in addition to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we'll be focusing on only one specific article. We'll be focusing on Article 6, and this article claims that everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Essentially, this article claims that all people are born with the natural right to be treated like a human, and basically this means that people are meant to be given autonomy over their bodies and over their minds and be given self-control, and that everyone is meant to be on an even plane despite gender, despite race, despite anything. They're meant to be the same. So this article essentially prohibits the discrimination and grants people the right to think for themselves and act out of free will. Although ideal on paper, it is more than common for the violation of this article to occur in the real world. And today, Girls Gone Great will be examining The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood and basically how it exemplifies the violation of Article 6 and the impacts of violating this article. The 5 of us have our own perspectives on how Atwood best conveys the violation throughout the novel, and we all look forward to sharing our knowledge on this topic with you. Before we start, this podcast is paid for and sponsored by the Mayday organization. Mayday aims to help free women who are trapped within the Gileadian regime that objectifies women and strips them of any rights. The abuse they face on behalf of the Gilead culture is a serious issue, and we aim to do anything within our capabilities to help free these women of Gilead's abusive restraints. If you know someone who is either enforcing the Gilead regime or trapped within it, please call 1-800-MAYDAY to report the issue and give these women a chance to regain their freedom. That was 1-800-MAYDAY. Again, that was 1-800-MAYDAY. So let's begin. Who wants to go first?
I can. My name is Grace, and today I'm going to be discussing Atwood's use of narration throughout the novel.
Sounds good. So, Grace, why do you believe that narration was the most influential technique that Atwood used to convey the impacts of violating Article 6?
Throughout The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood uses many techniques to show the oppression not only of human rights, but more specifically women. The significance of the loss of the human autonomy is best seen, I think, through narration in The Handmaid's Tale, and also it can be shown through real world examples. So, for example, when Alfred is telling how she would test the city's barriers by, kind of that outer wall that surrounds Gilead, but also the surveillance by the guards, she's telling this to Glenn, where she says, "Now and again we vary the route. There's nothing against it as long as we stay within the barriers. A rat in a maze is free to go anywhere, as long as it stays inside the maze." On page 165, within this quote, Alfred explains how her and Glenn would, explore the different routes throughout Gilead before and after, the excursions that they would go to, but these excursions were controlled because they weren't allowed to go anywhere without being watched or, supervised. So with the rule that the handmaids could only go so far within the town with even the supervision, Fred is still aware that the concept of these rules is not putting them any more superior to someone that's quite literally sitting in a jail cell. The narration of Fred's views, I think, personally signifies how the handmaids suffered such a loss of autonomy, and that it was considered a crime to walk outside of the otherwise controlled environment. Atwood's metaphorical comparison of a rat in a maze, it kind of represents the constraints that the handmaids have, and this further exemplifies the detrimental nature of lacking basic human rights. The strict restraints and protocols really signified the violation of Article 6, as the handmaids were forbidden to walk freely in their own city, Gilead. Next, Fred is at the doctor when she states, "His hand between my legs. Most of these guys can't make it anymore," he says, "or they're sterile." I almost gasped. He said a forbidden word, sterile. There is no such thing as a sterile man anymore. Not officially. There are only women who are fruitful and women who are barren. That's the law. On page 61, Fred is at a doctor's appointment checkup when the doctor tries to convince her to allow impregnation, and this comment really disturbs Fred. And while the blame of failure of conception always falls on women, this example represents how the society uses women not only as a means of reproduction, but this also entirely strips them of their own individual being and rights as a person. I would argue that this demonstrates the violation of Article 6 by further representing the dehumanization that women face. They're continuously objectified in the eyes of men and also even in the eyes of women. The men are viewed as more people, and due to this, they force all of the blame onto the woman in which they objectify. So when the doctor uses the term sterile, it would have been applicable to both men and women if they were rightfully abiding by Article 6. However, I would argue that the idea that men are incapable of being sterile further objectifies women to being either fertile or not, and this places a lot of blame on them and also pushes them more below men on the totem pole by further diminishing their autonomy.
Grace made some very interesting points regarding narration. Retha, what do you think of the novel?
Okay, well, take the dialogue, "Blessed be the fruit, and may the Lord open," on pages 19, 129, and 283. Here, Atwood uses religion to justify the rigid social roles and enslavement of the few remaining fertile women. Because it's an anaphora, it therefore represents the text holistically because it's a reoccurring phrase throughout the entire novel. So here's a little context behind the quote. So in chapter 4, Afghan is introduced by saying the accepted greeting among handmaids, to which Fred answers the accepted response. The same can be said for the introduction of the new Afghan in chapter 44. And in chapter 22, Fred thinks about the story of what happened to Moira. Part of it she could fill in herself, and part of it she heard from Alma, who heard it from Dolores, who heard it from Janine, who then heard it from Aunt Lydia. Here's a part of the story which she could fill in herself. "Blessed be the fruit, Janine," Aunt Lydia would have said. "May the Lord open," Janine would have replied. Notice that repeated word, would. These phrases are expected and are the antithesis of original because it's customary for Aunt Lydia and Janine to exchange them between each other. This shows that there's no individuality in the Republic of Gilead. There's only uniformity and conformity. The use of this word, would, emphasizes the extent to which the regime's ideology has influenced daily dialogue between women.
So, how was the current violation in the Declaration of Human Rights predicted by Atwood in her dystopic novel?
I actually can answer your question in a question. Does everyone have the right to recognition everywhere as a person, as Article 6 reads, or as a collective? Let me further dissect the quote using devices. Okay, so biblical allusion is one of the most important devices Atwood uses because it's the ground that this totalitarian regime is built upon. Without it, there would literally be no Gilead. "Blessed be the fruit" alludes to the celebration of the conception and birth of Jesus Christ. In the dystopic novel, it takes kind of an ironic shift, establishing an oppressive tone. Rather than celebrating childbirth, it subjugates the handmaids to mere vessels for reproduction, a word repeated throughout the novel by various different characters, which begs the question, does everyone have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law or before the Bible? And what's more, the euphemism in the word "blessed" suggests a hidden undertone within the entire quote. It veils the oppressive reality of their existence as mere vessels for reproduction, as they are indoctrinated to accept that this reality is a blessing rather than a violation of their human rights. The fruit is a synecdoche because a whole, which is the maiden's purpose and identity, is represented by one of its parts, which is the fruit. It's also an anti-prosopopoeia, as it serves to dehumanize and objectify the handmaids by reducing them and likening them to that fruit. They're not recognized for their humanity and individuality, rather they're recognized for their ability to reproduce, which violates their right to recognition as a person holistically rather than them partially, which is just that they can bear children. The word "Lord," which is said in the accepted response following after that, is a metonymy because the word replaces and represents power and authority, which is a common motif seen throughout the entire novel, and Atwood does this for the purpose of adding significance to religion in order to justify the regime's ideology of power over women. Also, the word open creates a visual image of conformity to the regime and their role within to literally open their legs.
So how do you believe this foreshadows the world of 2023?
So this quote ties into discussions surrounding both the separation of church and state and the pro-choice, pro-life debate within abortion rights in 2023. So while pro-lifers advocated against abortion and justified that ideology behind the Bible, pro-choicers argued for women's autonomy over their own bodies and a separation of church and state so that the Bible wouldn't be law, which is what it is in the Republic of Gilead.
All right, before you finish up, would you like to share just one more quote from the novel to strengthen your argument?
Yes, I would. So in chapter 11, page 61, the doctor tells Fred he could help her. And when he said that old guys are sterile, a forbidden word, Fred responds with, "There are only women who are fruitful and women who are barren. That's law." The parallelism of the phrase women who are emphasizes the classing of women based on their fertility. Atwood does this for the purpose of reinforcing that theme of dehumanization and objectification, which I talked about before, as the handmaids are denied that intricacy of womanhood and reduced to their biological purpose, which is to reproduce. The denotation in the word only adds to the rigidness of these social rules in the Gildean society by excluding other categories beyond those defined by fertility only. Also, the aphorism in "that's law" suggests that the general truth is not subject to change or subject to question, implying that the regime's ideologies are like absolute and must be followed without any question. The handmaids are denied the right to literally challenge authority and are seen as like puppets in a show, not humans. Further, the ideology that it is forbidden to call a man sterile because there's no such thing anymore, not officially, suggests a paradox within the implication that these men exist unofficially, which also highlights the existence of hidden truths veiled by the regime's manipulation of language. It also serves to reinforce social roles and the unequal nature of women and men, which weakens women by only burdening them with the fertility issues. So through dialogue, Atwood shows the violation of human rights, that everyone should be recognized equally as a person.
I think you made some really valid statements. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm now interested on how the setting had an impact on this. Rita, can you tell us what you think?
Yes, of course. Hello everyone, my name is Rita Baca, and while I agree Atwood utilized many different literary techniques, I believe that the setting was the most influential technique in depicting the violation of Article 6. So just to go through everything, throughout the entire piece, Atwood uses setting to illustrate the loss of human rights as she depicts a somewhat dystopian society. So these women are oppressed and stripped of their freedoms, and she really sets the scene with the setting of Gilead and how it's enforced with strict rules and surveillance and oppressive atmospheres. And this kind of creates like a backdrop that highlights the loss of human rights in the story from the start. And so we see this in the first chapter as Atwood is describing the room of the handmaid, and she's really clear, and she uses imagery to depict how the rooms were so empty and so simple and so basic, and there was nothing really unique to it, and it wasn't personalized whatsoever. And this kind of conveys how little control they had and how their rights were really being revoked. And we see this through the quote, "They removed anything you could tie a rope to," showing how even the settings, like where they are placed, they have no control over themselves and their lives and anything. They can't even choose whether they want to be alive or not, and that is insane, and this is really seen the setting. And so she kind of continued using the setting on page 22, where she starts describing Gilead itself, and she depicts the town in all of its glory and its perfection, talking about its so-called tidy lawns and whatnot. And these like devices of visual imagery and similes help further emphasize how perfect Gilead's setting really is, and this demonstrates that there is such an external perfection in the town that's used to hide the corruption at the center. And what I mean by this is that Atwood kind of uses setting to help cover up what's really wrong and how the basic human rights of the handmaids are being revoked and how there's so much control being occurring in the town itself and how this is all occurring. And so everything from the outside is meant to look perfect and fine, but truly on the inside, everything is so corrupt. There are no, like, I don't know how to say it, but these women have no control over their lives, and this demonstrates how Article 6 is being so violated, and it's really seen through the setting. And this kind of is also seen throughout the entire book, really, but now more towards like the end of it on page 137, she's talking about how one of the handmaids, her name is Offred, she goes into the commander's office. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. She walks into the office, and to a normal person, this office is pretty average. There's a desk with a computer, a black leather chair, some pens and papers. And like I said, to the average human eye, this is something that is so normal. This is probably what you would see in any teenager's room right now, or even any office whatsoever. And this, her reaction to the office itself is kind of, it's crazy to me, because she sees how this average setting, this is something that's so unusual and abnormal to her. And this really paints an image as to how barricaded and stripped of life the handmaids really are. If something that is so ordinary is seen as extraordinary, that is insane. And so Atwood really uses the setting of a regular office and it has such like a power on demonstrating how little control they really have over their life, and how stripped of life the handmaids really are, and how corrupt and violated their rights are, especially on Article 6, you know?
That's really interesting on how she conveys so much with just the setting. Rita, can you tell me how this violation itself is seen today in real life, and how it was just so well predicted by Atwood's writing?
Yes, of course, I would love to expand on that. So from what we've seen, Article 6 talks about how every human has the right to be recognized as a person. And what I talked about earlier is how the setting kind of depicts that. And so, to be honest, we see how these women have no control over themselves or their lives. And I feel like we really see this today with the abortion bans. And this is happening in the U.S. So according to my research, if abortion bans continue to be banned throughout the entire U.S., the number of maternal deaths would increase by 24%. That's insane. Like, these abortion bans have been so significant and have been impacting all the reproductive rights that women have and all their access to healthcare. These bans really, really limit a woman's autonomy and decision making, leading to unsafe and illegal procedures to occur. This is so harmful to society, as like I said, they lead to these unsafe procedures, and more importantly, they infringe on women's reproductive rights, limiting their access to any necessary health care that they need. And it completely violates Article 6, as women are getting their rights ripped away from them and not being looked at as humans based on a specific party's beliefs and our government and what they think. And they're allowing this to happen, stripping women of any decisions that they can make. And we see this happening in a controlled government here in the U.S., and we also kind of saw all of this happening in Gilead, and Atwood kind of depicted the setting, and I feel like she really foreshadowed this happening here for us. So I feel like setting, it has a big impact on conveying the violation of Article 6 as we see it in the book and as we see it here as a global issue.
This episode has been briefly interrupted by our sponsors. Can't believe it's not butter, the lotion that gives you healthier and younger looking skin. To get this limited time offer now, ask your commanders. Again, ask your commanders. Thank you.
Really strong points, Rita. Thank you for sharing. So, Larsa, I know that you studied upon imagery. Would you like to share your thoughts?
Okay, so I'm arguing that Atwood uses imagery as her most influential technique because she uses imagery to demonstrate how religion is used to violate Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that every person has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. She also predicts this article being violated in the world today, which we'll see later. So the first place we can see this is on page 19 of The Handmaid's Tale, where Atwood writes, "She walks demurely, head down, red-gloved hands clasped in front, with short little steps like a trained pig's on its hind legs. During these walks, she has never said anything that was not strictly orthodox, but then, neither have I. She may be a real believer, a handmaid in more than name. I can't take the risk." The image Atwood portrays through this simile and short little steps like a trained pig's represents how the government has taken control and trained the people of Gilead to act strictly orthodox, or else they'd be severely punished. The government's control can again be seen in Elfred's descriptions of Evelyn, where she says she walks demurely, head down. This timid visual imagery in Evelyn's movements represents her fear of the government and fear of being caught as a non-believer, which we later learn throughout the book that she is one. And the double entendre in a handmaid in more than name demonstrates Elfred's suspicion that Evelyn works for the government and that she's not just a handmaid, but she's also a handmaid for the government, if that makes sense. Atwood also continues to use the technique of imagery on page 180, where she describes the reaction to the government's violation of people's rights. She writes, "There were marches, of course, a lot of women and some men. When it was known that the police, or the army, or whoever they were, would open fire almost as soon as any of the marches even started, the marches stopped. A few things were blown up, but you couldn't even be sure who was doing it. It could have been the army, to justify the computer searches, and the other ones, the door-to-doors." The visual imagery within this quote, where she says, "would open fire as soon as any of the marches even started," shows how the government's putting an end to any resistance or rebellion to their new control before it could even start or rise any further, effectively snuffing out the people's voices, which takes away their right to freedom of expression. This violates Article 6 because without a voice, you don't have a person, so they're taking away their person by taking away their voices. Also, the polysyndeton in the police, or the army, or whoever they were, demonstrates Elfred's anger at having her voice and her person taken away, that she reduces whoever's doing this to whoever, showing that she is trying to take away their person as much as they are trying to do to her. Also, the euphemism used in the other ones, the door-to-doors, as a less offensive substitute for the innocent people, like being harassed in their own homes with the army coming and searching through their houses, shows how they're viewed as objects and not people, because they're just able to go in and take a look at whatever they want. Also, Atwood's use of imagery can once again be seen on page 212 before the Pravaganza scene, where she writes, "Soothing to the eye, the eyes, for that's who this show is for. We're off to the Pravaganza to demonstrate how obedient and pious we are." The repetition of eyes creates a visual image of always being watched, and they act as a metaphor for the government, but they can also act as a symbol for God, because it's supposed to show that God is always watching the people of Gilead, so they are forced to behave because of this knowledge. This implies that the government uses religion as a front for their controlling ways and to support their regime, which can again be seen in the sarcastic connotation of show coupled with the adjectives of obedient and pious, which creates an image of a play or performance being put on to appease the government, representing the lack of choice that they have, being that they are forced to act a certain way. Also, Atwood uses imagery on page 292 to demonstrate the fear that disobeying the government brings to the people of Gilead by writing, "I could set fire to the house. I could tear my bedsheet into strips and twist it into a rope of sorts. I could go to the commander, grab him round the knees, confess, weep, implore. I could noose the bedsheet round my neck. I could hide behind the door, wait until she comes, bearing whatever sentence, penance, punishment. I could walk at a steady pace down the stairs and out the door. I could go to Nick's room." The repetition of "I could" within this paragraph emphasizes how desperate Elfred is to find a solution to escaping the government after she fears they are coming for her. Also, this coupled with the asyndeton in knees, confess, weep, implore, demonstrates again her fear of the government, that she's willing to beg for her life to a person who works for the government in order to get out, because that's the only choice she has left. Also, the suggestive connotation of sentence, penance, punishment implies nobody knows the true extent of how far the government is willing to go with the people who disobeyed them, which also demonstrates her fear of the government. And Atwood's use of imagery within her book, The Handmaid's Tale, emphasizes and predicts how people in power can use religion as a front for their controlling and manipulative ways to violate a person's individuality, which in turn violates Article 6 of the Universal Human
Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is seen in modern-day Iran, where Iranian Christians are being killed in the Islamic Republic for their faith, which is taking away their right to practice a faith of their choosing, which in turn takes away their person, as religion is a big part of someone's person.
So Maddie, we've heard from everybody else. What do you think your thoughts are on this subject?
For me personally, I believe that throughout The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood best utilized characterization to convey the violation of Article 6. For example, on page 24, it's discussed how the political system used education to manipulate the girls and sort of lessen them as humans. Throughout the novel, Aunt Lydia was a character who was essentially the primary teacher, and she said there's more than one kind of freedom to and freedom from. In the days of anarchy, it was freedom to. Now you are being given freedom from. Don't underrate it. So she said this on page 24, and I think this exemplifies the utilization of characterization because it sort of characterizes all the girls as trapped under a contorted example of freedom, and Aunt Lydia is meant to represent the Gilead political system through her teachings, and it also indirectly characterizes her through her speech, and overall this indirect characterization contorts the meaning of freedom. Regarding Article 6, this term freedom and the right to be viewed as a person and a human means that all humans are essentially subject to the same laws, and these laws aren't meant to be changing or based on the categorization of people. They're just meant to be the laws for humans. However, as Atwood conveyed through the indirect characterization of the girls, through their actions, which again were politically controlled, the freedoms that they experience are changing and subjective depending on this categorization, and this categorization is therefore what lessens them as humans. Additionally, throughout the novel, Alfred discusses her perspective of herself fairly frequently throughout the book. She's constantly stating how the government has made her feel as less than a human, and this is like a reoccurring theme, and this is exemplified best when she describes the girls as Gilead as the people who were not in the papers. We lived in the blank white spaces at the edges of the print. It gave us more freedom. We lived in the gaps between the stories. So this quote is really heavy on the indirect characterization because the metaphorical lines on the paper and the books are meant to sort of symbolize the outlines of a person and what a person should be. And again, this Article 6 referred to being a human as a stable, sort of permanent state. However, this in-between state that the girls live in, as characterized through Fred's thoughts, this sort of in-between state pushes them as less than humans because, again, they're not allowed to live on the outline or live on the surface. They're forced to sort of find a space in between and forced to fit themselves in throughout the regime of Gilead. So again, through this characterization, it is demonstrated how Margaret Atwood utilized characterization to represent the violation of Article 6. So throughout the text, another example of this is again Fred sort of describing her perspective of herself. Only in this instant, it is more so on an individual foundation, whereas in the last example, it was sort of more of a consensus. So she talks about how she thinks of herself in contrast to how she used to view herself. For example, on pages 73 through 74, she says, I used to think of my body as an instrument of pleasure or as a means of transportation or an implement for the accomplishment of my will. I could use it to run, push buttons of one sort or another, make things happen. There were limits, but my body was nevertheless lithe, single, solid, one with me. Now the flesh arranges itself differently. I'm a cloud congealed around a central object, the shape of a pear, which is hard and more real than I am, and glows red within its translucent wrappings. This characterization really demonstrates Atwood's intention to sort of just convey the loss of bodily autonomy that the women of Gilead face through this objectification that the political regime of Gilead sort of enforced. To be a person, according to Article 6, is to be in control of your thoughts, of your body, having autonomy, having this sort of self-control, and not consistently being objectified. However, as conveyed through the indirect characterization through Fred's thoughts on pages 73 through 74, the loss of autonomy that she faces is in clear violation of Article 6. Before this manipulation, Fred had viewed her body as another aspect of various important parts of her. It was sort of more of a physical extension of her internal self, and, she was one with her body. However, now this loss of humanity sort of separated her from her body. her perception of herself is merely as an object, and rather like being in harmony with her body, she refers to it as the flesh and congealed around a central object and the shape of a pear. Her body is no longer an extension of herself, but rather just like a physical shell that kind of encases her, and this shell is being controlled by the political regime of Gilead. Through this indirect characterization of Fred's thoughts of her perception of herself, it demonstrates the violation of Article 6 through this objectification and loss of humanity.
So I understand how this is present throughout the text, and I really liked what you had to say, but how would you say this is conveyed in the real world?
So throughout the real world, this is especially present. For example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban took over a few years ago, and this is now in violation of Article 6 regarding women's rights to be viewed as a human. This has been ongoing since 2021. Women have been just losing more and more freedoms, similar to what we saw in Gilead. They've been prohibited from gaining an education, and they even established the Female Moral Police Department in August 2022. And basically, they're just continuing to strip women in Afghanistan of their rights as human beings, and instead of being on that same plane with the men, they are now objectified and less than men again, which therefore dehumanizes them. So that's how the violation of Article 6 is presented in the real world, especially. Okay, so that is the end of our podcast, and just for a quick conclusion, I'd like to say we all have fairly valid arguments, and we all made super good points regarding Atwood's use of various techniques. Again, we utilized narration, dialogue, setting, characterization, and imagery, and we all argued that Margaret Atwood utilized these in really good ways that conveyed the violation of Article 6 throughout her text, and thank you so much for listening.